think we probably have more people online than we have here in the room. My name is Thembi Mwamakamba. I am the Regional Policy Officer for the GCRF AFRICAP program. This morning, we are going to be discussing iFEED. I'm sure we're going to hear more about it as we go along. Our program is just going to start now at 11, and we are going to finish at 1 p.m. Southern Africa time. To begin the program, I would like to thank Dr. Nalishebo Mabelo, who is the iFEED Regional Champion and Executive Director of RENAPRI, and is the convener of this meeting as the Regional iFEED Champion. I would also like to welcome Fanapan Chief Executive Officer and Head of Mission, Dr. Chilizi Matsibandila, to give his official welcome and to open the meeting before I hand over to Dr. Mabelo. Dr. Matsibandila, over to you.
I thank you so much, Thembi, and thank you so much for inviting me to give you the opening remarks for the workshop today. Maybe before I proceed too far, let me also then establish the protocol. First, let me thank Professor Tim Benton, who is the principal investigator for the GCRF Africa project. Also, like you have said, let me also then thank the Chief Executive Director of RENAPRI, Dr. Nalishebo Mabelo, for convening today's workshop. And let me also then further extend to say that she is a member of the AFRICAP Strategic Advisory Board and also iFEED Regional Policy Champion. And for this valuable work, we really thank her for being part of the project. Also, let me acknowledge distinguished GCRF Africa leadership and researchers, both from UK and from here in the continent. Let me also acknowledge the GCRF Africa program partners, specifically the University of Leeds, who has been very much valuable in terms of providing us with research evidence. The Chatham House, then who also then built Fanapan capacity in terms of making sure that we are adhering to best mechanisms to make sure that the evidence that we gather talk to decision and policies. The University of Aberdeen, they've been valuable in terms of supporting the work of the project. UK Met in terms of making sure that the capacity that they have is also then benefiting the institutions that were working here then within the continent in the 4 countries in which we are working. So I will not be fair if I don't acknowledge the valuable contribution by the Fanapan national nodes, specifically Malawi, Tanzania, South Africa, and Zambia. And Thembi has already then spoken about the Ifit Champions. We do have got a regional coordinator, and we also have the national policy champions in terms of making sure that the research evidence that we are gathering then doesn't stay in shelf or remain in shelf, but then it continue to be disseminated. Those that are joining us for the first time in terms of interfacing with the Africa work, we really thank you for joining today's workshop for you to be able to understand what is it that we've been doing in the last 3 years or so. That said, then maybe to contextualize my opening remarks, let me first by acknowledging that we all know that agriculture remains one of Africa's most important economic sectors. And for that, we know that climate risk and incidences of acute shocks, both climatic and non-climatic, are intensifying across the continent. And these are negatively impacting on 1, agricultural production, number 2, the food systems, and number 3, at the impact scale in terms of food and nutrition security. And therefore, what we are advocating here is that there is a dire need to build resilience in terms of making sure that African agriculture is transformed and is adapting to the changing and variable climate. And one of the things that this project then seeks to do and achieve is to make sure that we are promoting robust research to generate evidence to inform policy processes and development practice to ensure that we mitigate these risks that I've spoken about. So against this backdrop, as FANAPAN, we have been lucky then to be participating within this program. And then not only did it then contribute in terms of transforming African agriculture, but it has also built the capacity of FANAPAN as institutions in terms of how best can we generate evidence, how best can we advocate to make sure that we are relevant to be dealing with the continental issues. So I won't really go deeper into what the project is all about. The speakers that will come after me, then they will elaborate on that. But what I need to emphasize is that as part of the research outputs from the project, we were able then to develop an integrated assessment framework, which we commonly call iFEED. And then we are going to be sharing this tool in terms of what it can do, how people can apply that in their own context to make sure that the work that they're doing is benefiting from this original work that we have been trying to pilot test in the last 3 years or so. But let me acknowledge some of the in-country work that we have participated in. Then in Zambia, then we've been working closely with the government of Zambia to develop an oilseed strategy. This is to demonstrate that we are aligning on already existing strategies that the countries are implementing. And also in Zambia, we are currently supporting the ongoing review of the National Agriculture Investment Plan. In South Africa, then we have accompanied the development of the Agriculture Master Plan. In Malawi, then we've been working with the National Planning Commission to unpack and implement the national resilience strategies at district level. We know that policy and strategies are developed at a high level, but they need now to come down to talk to local issues. This is the work that we are doing. In Tanzania, we are engaging with district level officials through Muheza Learning Alliance. So this is to demonstrate that then as AFRICAP, we are hooking our relevance in terms of the already ongoing work that is happening within the continent and in the countries where we are implementing the GCRF Africa project. There are 3 things that I would want to highlight here that since now we are coming towards to the end of the program, we need to scale up, to scale out, and to scale deeper. By scaling up, I mean that then the work that we're doing need to now start to influence how institutions are implementing their policies and frameworks, and also talking to the policies and practice. Scaling out, where we need to impact numbers, then to make sure that our work is reaching more people who have not been part of the pilot places where we have been implementing our work. Scaling deeper is about changing relationships. So how can we as Africa continue to change the relationship that was built with the local people that we've been working with? How can we change the belief and the way that people at a local scale are doing their work to make sure that they're adapting to the changing and variable climate? One thing that I also need to emphasize, and this should be a take-home message and it should inform how we then take through the proceedings of the day, that what I wish for and that we need to adopt as a strategy is that we need to focus on 3 main things. And these are borrowed from how we as FANAP and then do our policy engagement and also do our policy influencing. One, we need to make sure that we have got the message. The presentation that will come after me here are going to be defining what is the message that as Africa then we wish to be communicating. Number 2, then we need to have messengers. We cannot just only have a message, but we need the messengers to carry their message, to make sure that we have got right messengers in place. We have engaged in the countries where we are working in, the regional and also the national policy champions. This is one of the mechanisms to make sure that we speak to a strategy, to make sure that we deploy the right messengers who will be ambassadors and people that will preach the gospel of iFEED. Number 3, we need to be engaging in the right platforms. So this is not the only platform that we're convening. There are other platforms where we participated in, and in the near future, we're going to be convening or in partnership with the stakeholders that are part of this project and beyond to make sure that we participate at the community level, at a national level, regional, and also at global levels. So this is the strategy that we're deploying to make sure that the research outputs that are coming out of this project then are starting to influence the policy and practice. The parting words from my side are that, as I conclude, the FANAPAN mission is about to build resilient food systems across Africa through co-creation, co-implementation, and co-assessment of the policies. However, what we need to note is that we have premised our 2016-2023 strategy to deliver on two thematic areas: climate smart agriculture and nutrition sensitive agriculture. And this is for this reason why the theme for today is about building integrated and inclusive climate smart nutrition secure pathways for sub-Saharan Africa. And this, I want to confirm that it talks to the FANAPAN mandate. Is all about how we want to deliver and finish well on our FANAPAN 2016-2023, that strategy that we are currently implementing. With these few words, then I welcome you and I wish you a fruitful deliberations. And thank you so much, Tembi. Back to you to make sure that the proceedings of the day, they run smoothly and we have got the outcomes that we anticipated as we communicated through the concept note that we have shared. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Matsibandela, for those words, and thank you for challenging us building resilient food systems in the African context. At this point, I would like to hand over to the convener of this meeting, Dr. Nalishebo Mavelo, to just walk us through what it's about, what we are to achieve, and how we are supposed to be working together to do that. Dr. Mavelo, over to you.
Thank you, Tembi. Allow me to recognize Dr. Shilizi Mazivandila from FANAPAN, and all distinguished persons who are both online and in South Africa in person. We welcome you to this workshop, which is meant to share insights into the iFEED processes. I have been part of GCRF AFRICAP for a number of years now, sitting on the Strategic Advisory Board. And I think it is through my role in GCRF AFRICAP that I have found myself being the regional champion for iFEED since somewhere early in this year. And I think I've really enjoyed being an ambassador for this process. And I look forward to iFEED actually moving beyond the 4 countries where it's been piloted to becoming an important tool for the region and also for the continent. So it is a pleasure to see all of you in the room. I see large numbers online, and I'm assuming we have similar numbers in person in South Africa. Tembi, I'm hoping that is the case. But I think already just the numbers online show the interest that iFEED has brought to the region, not only in the 4 countries, but also to the region. So my role this morning is to simply share with you the objectives of today's workshop. And I have prepared Tembi and Ian a small presentation just to be able to give my words a visual. So basically I'm sharing the workshop objectives, and I thought I should begin with a small introduction. I know that Shilizi has said 1 or 2 things about the iFEED tool, but I just thought I should have say 1 or 2 points around it for the benefit of, yes.
Hi.
Can you?
Sorry, just if you can go to presentation mode.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Okay. There we go. Oops.
It's the TV sign on the mine is close to.
There we go. Am I in presentation mode?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. So very quickly, the iFEED tool, all of us know is something new, and it brings together state-of-the-art crop and climate modeling with a view to mapping pathways to desirable futures. So this is about mapping pathways, mapping policy pathways to desirable futures. And this has been done through trade and nutrition analysis, expert knowledge, and stakeholder-driven research agendas. So the iFEED crop modeling is used to project the impacts of climate change on a range of agricultural commodities and examine possible future land use patterns to explore implications for future nutrition security and climate smart agriculture. So what I like about this tool is that it actually looks to the future to enable planning as opposed to looking backwards. It's really about what do we see in the future to help us plan. So the outcome of this process over the past few years is an assessment of national nutrition security, greenhouse gas emissions, and resilience to extremes for a range of possible food system futures. So for this work, gratitude, of course, goes to the partners who have been part of this, and you saw them in my first slide. The implementers, and I just want to thank also FANAPAN for being part of the drivers of this tool in the continent. And importantly, the FANAPAN node hosting institutions in the 4 case study countries, because these institutions have been fully participating and facilitating the iFEED processes at country level in the 4 countries, Malawi, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia, where I come from. So it's really exciting that this has been happening in those 4 countries. And with that work, we expect to see some kind of scaling out of the iFEED program, hopefully into the rest of the region and probably the continent. So in terms of workshop objectives, we expect that we will be sharing research evidence that is generated from the iFEED processes, and we'll be sharing this with key national and regional stakeholders who are on this call and of course down in South Africa. And this is with the view to inform policy processes in the 4 study countries and of course spilling over into the region. We will be seeking feedback and we hope that we will get objective feedback from those who are participating in this workshop. And this is feedback concerning the results, e.g. on important missing areas or inaccuracies. So be as objective and as truthful as you can to help us to strengthen the tool, but also help to strengthen the results that have resulted from this tool, the use of this tool. We also expect to inform messaging of final policy documents to maximize uptake and engagement of stakeholders. So in terms of long-term expectations, we expect to promote the use of high-quality, policy-relevant research and evidence to build improved, integrated, and inclusive climate-smart, nutrition-secure pathways in sub-Saharan Africa. Long-term, we also expect to inform policy formulation, strategies, plans, and programs. You know that at the moment we have national agriculture investment plans in the countries. This could be useful. We are aware that there was a call to action after the UN Food Systems Summit. And we also know that recently there was a call to action after the COP26 in Glasgow. So we see that this tool and its outcomes will be useful in supporting countries to plan to achieve the call to action from those events I've just spoken about. So participants in today's workshop includes policymakers, government officials, civil society organization, regional economic communities, development partners, farmers organizations, private sector, researchers and academics, and the media. And if these groups, of course, are not in the room for whatever reason, we will still be engaging them because we believe that the iFEED tool is really meant to inform them as they proceed with their work in the African continent around strengthening sustainable and resilient food systems. So on that note, that's my short introduction to the objectives of today's workshop. And I just want to really request you to enjoy yourselves as you listen to the presentations from the different countries, but also welcome you to give your feedback so that, as I said earlier on, we can strengthen the tool, but also strengthen the research outcomes that will be shared with you. So over to you, Tembi, and thank you once again to the partners, the implementers, and our node countries in the 4 project countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mavelo, for walking us through why we are here today, gathered here in Pretoria, but also with everyone that is online. I was just scrolling through the list of participants online, and I have seen some very familiar names from our colleagues that work within government in the different countries where we're working, our colleagues from the University of Leeds, from the other different research institutions that have an interest in iFEED. And thank you very much to everybody that is joining us. We are going to move on now in our program to view the iFEED video that's going to just in a short while set the scene for the presentation that will follow from Professor Andrew Challoner, who is going to be giving us an overview of the iFEED process. So Kanto, over to you if you could just screen the short video before we welcome Professor Challoner. Thank you.
We are already experiencing the impacts of climate change in the Southern Africa region. We are seeing more occurrences of droughts and floods. We are also seeing more occurrences of pests and diseases resulting from climate change. This has resulted in shortages of food, but at the same time, the region is grappling with the challenge of malnutrition.
In some cases here where we are supposed to be already in the short rain season, which is starting from October to December. It's October already, but there hasn't been no rain at the moment. So farmers who are used to grow during this short rain season can no longer grow anything.
There's uncertainty about what the future might look like. So what we hope is that iFEED will be able to support the decision-making so that we don't end up making decisions now that make the future really hard.
If we have a high climate risk and then we have low technology, then there is a serious problem because we are under very high risk and then we don't have the means to adopt to how we are going to survive under those situations.
For longest time, there has been a disconnect between research evidence and also policy and decision side. So what we've realized is that there is a lack of capacity. And what iFEED is doing is make sure that there's all the stakeholders that are involved in the process of generating the evidence are involved within a workshop to make sure that we collate all the inputs, to make sure that the tool itself and the results that are generated thereof then are more relevant and are delivering what's supposed to do in terms of national planning and decisions.
iFEED stands for the Integrated Future Estimator for Emissions and Diets. It's evidence-based, designed to build sustainable policy pathways in sub-Saharan Africa.
So iFEED, in its analysis, is giving us evidence about the future climatic patterns based on what we are actually seeing now and projections, even backward projections, and be able to give us a picture on how these are going to impact our farming engagements and who is likely to be affected. And then that gives us impetus to say, how do we support or address these challenges for the people or for the farmers that will be affected? So it's a very important project. It's a very important engagement in that regard.
It includes people from climate science, people from food science. We've got scientists from meteorology. We've also got people from agriculture, from economics. It's a mixture of different expertise coming together to find a common solution.
We looked at what are the crop physiological processes that happens in the plant and how those are affected by the climate impacts, as well as probably the extreme events that are happening in the AFRICAP target countries.
So for example, they can come up with projections to say, within the next maybe 3 to 4, 5 years, we are likely to see these kind of climatic patterns. And these are the kind of effects that we are likely to experience in the productivity, in maize production or in livestock production. And these are the kind of interventions that are likely to be, that we can promote to address and mitigate some of the effects that we might actually see. That's the difference.
It involves the understanding developed not only from the models and data, but also by interactions with experts and local stakeholders in the AFRICAP countries that we work in.
Participatory scenario workshops were a series of workshops that we had right at the start of the project, where we brought in experts and stakeholders and said, what matters to you when you're thinking about the future of agriculture in your country? What's important?
We are trying as a scientist to provide evidence. So this is evidence-based. When we provide the evidence of what we already have and what might happen in the future, that's when policymakers can use these evidences to suggest or to show the way how things should be done in the future, because we know that even in our lifetime, things have changed. They have not been the same as when I was a little kid, and now things are actually changing fast going into the 2050s.
iFEED is hopefully going to be a useful tool to policymakers throughout the food system, particularly in the 4 focal countries of AFRICAP. I think its real utility is taking a holistic view and thinking about how all of the different elements of the food system come together, particularly given the huge uncertainties over what food systems might look like by 2050, mid-century.
For me, it is like a preparation plan so that come 2050, we shall have known already that these things were anticipated. So for me, it's a very good plan that gives a calendar for us on what we can do, that gives action plans on what we can do so that we are not caught unawares by the emissions that may increase if we don't do anything, and climate change may become worse if we don't do anything, and it may impact on availability of food and improvement on nutrition or diets in general to the Zambian people and the people in the rest of the world at large.
My personal dream, if I can put it that way, is for this tool to be replicated beyond the pilot countries that at the moment are just Malawi, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia.
We want to call upon policymakers, we want to call upon governments, we want to call upon farmer organizations, civil society organizations, and all other relevant stakeholders to use the information, to use the evidence that has been generated by the iFEED project to inform their programs, to inform their policymaking processes, so that we can be able to provide sustainable livelihoods for our people in our respective countries, as well as in our region at large.
Thank you, Kanto, for sharing that video. The video, I'm sure, is available on the iFEED website, and the link will be shared in the chat so that people can watch it again, but also can share it with other colleagues that are not here in this meeting. At this point, I would like to hand over to Professor Andy Challoner, who is going to walk us through the iFEED process.
Thank you very much, Tembi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Great. We've had some technical issues here, and my main computer thinks it's 2009. And I've been unable to get my slides up, but I think that's fine. I'm quite happy to talk you through the process of iFEED and why iFEED for in kind of under 10 minutes. So first of all, why iFEED? What is iFEED? It's an integrated assessment framework. And what that means is we're doing more than just running models and producing maps based on model output. So it's an open and inclusive approach to the use of models and wider expertise and data. So it's useful for problems that can be partially modeled, and it's useful for problems where we know that stakeholder engagement, stakeholder input and stakeholder engagement in getting policy messages out there are important. And that's particularly why this approach has been really useful in this project, and with the partnership of FANAPAN and the nodes and the task forces really helping us to do a good job of that. So it's a flexible approach where you can target complexity in the right places. So you can use a simplified way of summarizing model information, if that's going to be the best way to do it. I won't go into the details of how we make that decision. Or we can do detailed modeling, we can do a mixture, and there's scope for early stakeholder engagement to orient the work, which is very much what we have done in AFRICAP with the task forces in iFEED. So a little bit about the process. Way back at the start of the AFRICAP project, there were a series of scenario workshops in each country where there were discussions on what are the basically asking the participants, the stakeholders, what are the main aspects of the future that you consider to be important, the drivers of future change, if you like. So high versus low climate risk, climate change essentially came out as an important issue, unsurprisingly. And then in each country, each of the 4 countries, different things came out as being the other sort of major driver of change. So land reform, for example, in South Africa, and other issues to do with agricultural technology, for example, in other countries. So then we were able to look at these combinations. So, for example, what happens under high climate risk and significant land reform? What happens in low climate risk and no or little land reform, etc. So we do all 4 of those combinations. So this is there's then a series of integrated modelling of various complexity as I've just described, and then a series of workshops to integrate information to bring in other expert views and stakeholder input there as well, of course. And so it's there in that process of between the models and the output from the models and the production of summary documents that summarize what the iFEED process says. We have at the heart of that a way of dealing with uncertainty, where we've taken our cue from what the IPCC do, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in terms of using calibrated statements to describe confidence in model results. So an example of that, we might have a statement where there is high confidence in crop yields changing in a particular direction, and it would be based on high agreement with the scientific literature. So as far as we can see in the scientific literature, this is in line with, it probably isn't exactly the same as, obviously, but it's in line with what's in the existing scientific literature. And then also on that confidence is based on what we call model robustness. And this model robustness is where we capture this, the uncertainty essentially. And we say, okay, we have run different climate model scenarios. We have run a different crop model actually scenarios as well, different adaptations and different aspects of in the crop modeling as well. And if these uncertainties, particularly in the climate models, point in different directions, then we would say, well, there's not a strong message. There's not clear robustness in the message. But in often what happened is actually there was robustness within a particular climate scenario. So we would say, okay, we have medium or high confidence based on essentially relatively low or medium uncertainty. So this robustness element really captures that issue of uncertainty. So we had these statements coming out of the modeling, which is about doing more than just producing maps and numbers. And we passed these statements on to the wider AFRICAP team. And the wider AFRICAP team, which included various people, from people with expertise in pests and diseases to the kind of social science of households dealing with climate change, And we passed these statements on to them and said, what statements can you make based on these conclusions that we are sending you that are based on the model results? And so, so these experts then produce calibrated statements. So for example, reductions in yields for cash crops are likely to lead to acute income loss, undermining household resilience and increasing financial vulnerability. Or another example, reductions in maize yields will likely lead to diversification and alternative staple starch food sources, e.g. cassava, potato, rice. And so these implication statements are specific to the particular region and draw on the expertise of the people making those statements, and of course on the broader literature as well. So I think that's one novelty really at the heart of iFEED. And I'd like to draw attention to another area of novelty within iFEED. So, well, first of all, what we're doing in iFEED, as you've already heard, is looking at how climate smart a system can be and how to develop pathways towards increased climate smartness. And that means reducing emissions whilst adapting to climate change and whilst increasing productivity. Those three goals, or sometimes also the sustainable development goals come into that umbrella as well. And I think the one of the real step forwards during iFEED has been the leadership from Aberdeen in the development of statements about nutrition security. So not just food security. A lot of people talk about food security and can make statements about food security, but we've gone that step further and said, well, let's look at the nutrient content of the various crops that are being produced, plus the accounting for the trade, international trade, so that we're then saying at a national level, so this is national level, not local level, but at a national level, what is the potential for nutrition security? Are there deficiencies? Under which scenarios are there deficiencies? Under which scenarios are there not deficiencies in, for example, iron, zinc, rather than just looking at calories and rather than just looking at protein. And obviously I don't have time now to talk you through some of the really interesting results there, but that's a key area of novelty. And the last thing I would highlight is the way in which we have developed a system of allocating the crops that are produced according to the land that's available, and been able to look at what happens with agricultural expansion, which often came up as one of the areas in the scenarios to think about. If we're increasing maize production, how are we increasing maize production? What is that at the expense of? And we've been able to have a detailed look at kind of how that occurs essentially. So I'm just looking through my notes to see if I've missed anything important. We will talk, you've already heard about the online results portal where all the results from iFEED are available. I also think a really key part of iFEED is actually the conversations. And we've had some really interesting conversations along the way with South Africa's Parliamentary Portfolio Committee, for example, and the Agricultural Master Plan, also Malawi's Vision 2063, Zambia's All-Seed Diversification Strategy. And I think it's those conversations, I would say, actually, that are really at the heart of iFEED as well. It's certainly not just a technical tool. So just in summary, there's a nice diagram that shows this. I can't show you at the moment, unfortunately, but showing the way in which we've gone from over 100,000 model simulations to over 1,000 of these implication statements that I've just described to you. And these are now being synthesized into 16 scenario documents. So these 4 scenarios per country times 4 countries. These 16 scenario documents then synthesized into policy documents. And as I say, one place on the web where you can access these, but also alongside that, the importance of conversations. And so great to see you all in the room at the Sheraton Hotel Pretoria, having discussions face to face, despite the adversities that are facing you there, and in some ways face all of us. So that's really nice to see. And with that, I will close and say thank you and pass over to Tembi.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for outlining the iFEED process. I think I always marvel because each time you present it's much simpler than when you read it for yourself, you know. So it's always easy. And I guess that's also the joy of us meeting here in person, because some of the things that get lost in translation over emails, over maybe some Zoom calls with sketchy connections, we can iron out here face to face. So yeah, so we are enjoying the privilege of being here, and hopefully before the end of this project, everyone who is online will have an opportunity to also meet in person. At this point, we're going to move on to the next segment of the program. If there are any questions for Andy, by the way, please just drop them in the chat so that at the end we can just review all the questions and have a good discussion. So the AFRICAP program, I think it was probably mentioned by Nalishebo when she was making her presentation, is structured in 3 ways. We have a group that is looking at pathways to climate smart agri-food systems, which is part of the iFEED process. But we also have a group that's looking at policy engagement and de-risking. And then we have a group that's looking at growing research capability. At this point, I would like to hand over to Dr. Claire Quinn, who leads the policy engagement and de-risking part of the AFRICAP program, to sort of take us together with her team through the different country messages that are coming out of iFEED, the outputs and the key messages. Claire, over to you.
Great, thank you, Tembi. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm just going to share my screen now. So hopefully that will start to appear for you all and you'll be able to see my slides. Please let me know if you have any problems seeing them. So what I want to do is lead us through a very whistle-stop tour of some of the initial policy outputs that we've been working on in relation to iFEED. And this is the result of a huge amount of work by lots of people. So there are a few of us listed on this page here who've been specifically involved in developing this presentation and the outputs that underlie it, but actually it's a much larger team. And as Andy said, there's lots of expertise that are looking at developing both the calibrated statements and the implication statements that underpin the outputs that we are in the process of developing. And it's very much a process. So Andy talked about the scenarios workshops that we first did back in 2018, very participatory process involving people from the ministries in each of our AFRICAP countries and academics, both of those countries and from the UK, really thinking about what the future might hold and what the future might look like. And since then, there's been a huge amount of modelling work, developing those calibrated statements and expert knowledge, on the ground research, bringing everything together to think about the implications of what those futures look like. And those calibrated and implication statements have then formed the basis of scenario summaries that we are now drawing together for each of our countries, and then bringing those together into country summaries. And then really in the last days and weeks, thinking about the emerging commonalities and cross-cutting topics that come out of this work. So for today, what we're going to focus on is those country summaries and those emerging commonalities, and start to highlight some of those things. But the scenario summaries and the country summaries should have been shared with everybody. So hopefully you've started to see those and started to have a look at those. Again, very much in draft form. And so we're really looking for feedback and conversations around those things as they develop. So first of all, we're going to start with Tanzania and just give you a quick overview of the outputs for Tanzania. So Marceline, if I can call upon you to talk to the next few slides.
Yes, good morning, everyone. So next slide, please. So we've heard about the scenario workshops that were organized in the 4 countries. In the case of Tanzania, we had 2 main drivers, for food systems transformation in food systems change in the future, which forms the 2 axes that led to the 4 scenarios that are presented here in this slide. Technological transformation and low to high, which is low meaning maybe technological stagnation, not enough change in food system technologies, and the low to high climate risk. So leading to the human capital scenario, which is a scenario in which characterized by low climate risk and technological stagnation. And in this future, it assumes that there is going to be expansion in arable and pastoral land, and increased crop diversity, but no expansion of irrigation. So the second scenario, which is the techno-fix, characterized by low climate risk and technological transformation. And in this one, it is assumed there is going to be crop diversification and expansion in crop and pastoral land and irrigation. And the climate chaos scenario is characterized by high climate risk and technological stagnation. So, and I just recall what the Tanzanian Ifit Champions said about, the concern about this kind of scenario, and which assumes that there is going to be an increase in cropland and pastoral land, but no expansion in irrigation and reduced crop diversity. And in terms of technology, there may be stagnation in terms of, for instance, crop breeding for climate resilience crops. And the intensive vulnerability scenario, which is characterized by high climate risk and significant technological innovation. And in this one, it is assumed there is going to be an expansion. It's cropland and pastoral land in irrigation, but there's going to be a decrease in crop diversity and a focus on smaller number of high yielding crops. Next slide. So the main messages really that are coming out from the iFEED process that Professor Charino just described are around the key aspects that were modeled, researched upon by the huge team that has been presented. So in terms of food production, under the food production and land use and irrigation, what we are going to see in Tanzania looking towards 2050 is that under all scenario, food production is going to increase, and this is largely going to be linked to land expansion in the low technology scenarios. But we have to note that land expansion is going to lead to significant yield increase in the high technology scenario. But the largest food production increase is projected to be in the intensive vulnerability scenario. But this, have to note that these production gains may come at the expense of increased yield shock due to a reduction in risk spreading across multiple crops. So under the food, the trade and nutrition security, food security, looking towards 2050 is going to be a challenge, especially in the low technology scenarios. This is because there's going to be insufficient calories produced domestically. So, but although nutrition security improves in the high technology scenarios, nutrition security and the reduction of other socioeconomic development goals are going to be very, very challenging, across the 4 scenarios. There's no doubt. Next slide. So in relation to the climate extremes, in Tanzania, again, looking towards 2050. So the main highlights are that under all scenarios, there is going to be
Lovely, thank you, Marcelan. So I now hand over to Helen from Chatham House, who's going to talk us through the South Africa outputs.
Thanks, Claire, and hello, everybody. So I'm going to give a summary of the country summary for South Africa, and then straight after that, Malawi. So first of all, next slide, please. So in South Africa, the main two determinants of future food production were land reform, ranging from little or no reform to significant land reform, and of course, climate risk, ranging from low risk to high risk. So in scenario one, familiar futures, this scenario is characterized by low climate risk and insignificant land reform. So this future assumes little change to arable crop areas, but increased livestock pasture and crop diversification. Scenario two, structural change, is characterized by low climate risk and significant land reform. And this future assumes crop diversification, a fall in arable crop areas, and an increase in livestock pasture areas. In scenario three, hot and bothered, this scenario is predictably characterized by high climate risk and insignificant land reform. And this assumes crop diversification, an increase in arable crop areas and irrigation expansion, and a decrease in livestock pasture areas. In scenario four, all change, this scenario is characterized by high climate risk and significant land reform. And in this scenario, there is crop diversification and a fall in agricultural area and irrigation expansion. Next slide, please. So in terms of food production, land use and irrigation, crop yields increase on average by around 50% across all scenarios. Maize remains the main crop, but there is diversity increasing in those scenarios. So, for example, in the low risk scenarios, around 10% of cropland currently used for maize is given over to other crops, and that increases to 25% in the high risk scenarios. With high land reform, food production increases substantially, but under the low climate risk trajectory, this increases potential for land conflict, and under high climate risk, crop and pasture areas decline, which could actually improve environmental sustainability. In terms of trade and nutrition security, nutrient supply generally improves from the baseline, and if nutrition is optimized through trade, a significant amount of calories could actually be exported without compromising domestic consumption. Next slide, please. In terms of climate extremes, they're likely to increase across all scenarios, including more drought and shortening of the rainy season across South Africa, and also an increase in the number of hot days, extremely hot days per month, up to around 3 days per month in the low climate risk, and up to about 6 days per month under the high climate risk. In terms of climate smartness, net emissions increase in all 4 scenarios, and non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions increase by around 50%. There is soil organic carbon losses in all 4 scenarios, while emissions intensity, so the amount of emissions per unit of food produced, declines in 3 of the 4 scenarios. Next slide, please. So the initial policy messages are that across all scenarios, there is a requirement for additional policy considerations to minimize the impacts of increased food production on ecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss, but also to limit conflict over land and water use. Next slide, please. Crop diversification and irrigation is needed to increase productivity and deal with the increasing climate extremes. And land reform requires bespoke policy response. So, for example, under significant reform, government support will be needed for successful uptake of new agricultural technologies. In newly created medium-sized land reforms, and under insignificant land reform, increased land conflicts will require management. Next slide, please. And now moving on to Malawi. Next slide, please. So in Malawi, the 2 main determinants of future food production were the effectiveness of agricultural policy implementation and climate risk, again, ranging from low to high risk, and the policy effectiveness ranging from low to high effectiveness. So in scenario 1, demanding but coping, this scenario is characterized by high climate risk and high policy implementation effectiveness. So this future assumes crop diversification and an increase in food production. Scenario 2, path to heaven, is characterized by low climate risk and high policy implementation effectiveness, and this assumes crop diversification and an increase in food production. Scenario 3, degrading economy, is characterized by low climate risk and low policy implementation effectiveness. And this future assumes little change to food production and crop diversification. And finally, scenario 4, the road to hell, is characterized by high climate risk and low policy implementation effectiveness. And this future assumes a decline in food production and no crop diversification. Next slide, please. So in terms of food production, land use and irrigation, maize remains the main crop, and food production remains the same or decreases in the low implementation effectiveness scenarios. In the high policy implementation effectiveness scenarios, food production, agricultural land area, and area under irrigation all increase substantially through intensification of production. Also in these scenarios, there is a large diversification away from maize in the scenarios with high policy implementation effectiveness, where all crops actually occupy the same cropland area. In terms of trade and nutrition security, in the scenarios with low policy effectiveness, food and nutrition security is not achieved for most nutrients, and there's actually a big dependency on imports of around 59%. And in scenario 2, with the high policy effectiveness, food and nutrition security is achieved for most nutrients, and up to around 50% of food could actually be exported in that scenario. Next slide, please. In terms of climate extremes, they are expected to increase across all scenarios and potentially impact domestic food production. In terms of climate smartness, non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions decrease slightly in the low policy effectiveness scenarios and increase substantially in the high implementation effectiveness scenarios. Net greenhouse gas emissions decrease in the high policy effectiveness scenarios, while net greenhouse gas emissions increase in the low policy effectiveness scenarios. And next slide, please. So the initial policy messages for Malawi are that the expected outcomes under each scenario are largely determined by the level of policy effectiveness rather than the actual climate impacts alone. So for example, in a scenario with lower climate impacts, food and nutrition security outcomes could actually be much less favorable compared to a higher climate impact scenario that has a greater response to adapt agricultural production. Next slide, please. And even in scenarios with high implementation effectiveness, additional careful policy considerations are needed to minimize the impacts of increased food production on pollution and biodiversity loss and to limit potential conflict over land and water use. And one really interesting example on that in Malawi was the iFEED modeling, which didn't include forests in the future agricultural land use, but woodlands, some of the woodlands in Malawi, the Mayombo woodlands, are not classed as forests, so they could potentially be threatened by an expansion of agricultural land use going forward. So there's some really interesting and important implications there. And that is all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And so I will now just give an overview of the Zambian policy outputs. So as all of the other countries, we have these scenarios and our two kind of key drivers, again, climate risk from low to high, and in Zambia's case, from low market connectivity and function up to high market connectivity and function. And so this creates our four scenarios. And scenario 1 is isolation and imperative. So high climate risk and low market connectivity. So here we assume that crop diversification happens and we expand irrigation, but there's a fall in the total agricultural area. Scenario 2 is called risk and reward, and again, characterized by high climate risk, but this time having high market connectivity. So in this future, we assume agricultural and irrigation expansion, but a fall in crop diversity. So we're focusing on a smaller number of crops and significant increases in imports and exports. Then scenario 3 is solitude and self-sufficiency. So low climate risk in this scenario, but also low market connectivity. So we assume in this future that there are no changes except for maybe some small amounts of crop diversification. And then the final scenario is opportunity and exposure. So this one is characterized by low climate risk, but high market connectivity. So this future assumes expansion of arable and pasture land, expansion of irrigation, increased diversification, and increased exports. And so when we look across these scenarios for Zambia, there are some key messages that emerge. So when we're looking at food production, land use, and irrigation, changes to the climate will decrease crop yields, and that will decrease by as much as 20%, and it will increase the occurrence and frequency of yield shocks by 2050. So yield shocks are where the yield drops significantly in a growing season because of the impacts of climate. But effective implementation of irrigation, of improved crop varieties, all of those things that we would see under a high market connectivity scenario will likely mitigate the effects of climate change. So they'll reduce the effects of decrease the rate of loss of crop yields, but also reduce the number of yield shocks, regardless of whether climate risk is low or high. Across all of our scenarios for Zambia, nutrition security is not achieved for all nutrients by 2050. So even if we have low climate risks and high market connectivity, we're not going to be able to grow enough food within Zambia to meet all of the nutritional needs of the population. And this is partly driven by how big the population is projected to get by 2050. So in all scenarios, we'll need some calories to be imported to meet domestic demand. So from a low of 23% up to 82% of those calories will need to be imported. And this is really driven by differences in market connectivity between our scenarios. For Zambia, under all of our scenarios, so even under low climate risk, average temperatures will increase, the frequency of temperature extremes will increase, and there will be a general shortening of the rainy season in Zambia. Greenhouse gas emissions will increase under the high market connectivity scenarios due to increased livestock and crop production, and decrease under the low market connectivity scenarios. Soil carbon stocks will decrease under the low market connectivity scenarios, but they're predicted to increase under the high market connectivity scenarios due to implementation of climate smart land management practices. So our initial policy messages coming out of these summaries is that we need effective policy implementation to improve farmer technologies, varieties, traits, irrigation, and so on. And we need inclusive and sustainable access to markets. If we can do those things, then we are in a good position to mitigate the effects of climate change on agriculture in Zambia. But it really will be determined by the availability and affordability of those technologies to all farmers if we can realise the benefits. So we're going to need significant support to farmers through financing, extension, weather services, in order to enable equitable access to technology and to markets. Diversification is a really important part of realising yield gains and to mitigate against the losses of a changing climate. Non-maize crops may present significant opportunities in Zambia for yield gains and to improve nutritional outcomes too. And there may well be new market opportunities for these new crops by 2050. So the potential to improve incomes as well. So that was kind of a whistle-stop tour of some of the information that's coming out, the summaries that we're producing for each of our countries, and what the policy implications of those things might be. Some emerging commonalities across all 4 countries are that all countries are facing increases in average temperatures and increasing frequency and occurrence of temperature extremes. So regardless of scenario, whether it's low climate risk or high climate risk, these things are in all of our scenarios. Our rainfall projections are much less certain in terms of whether rainfall will increase or decrease over the rainy season, but most of the rainy seasons look like they're shortening. Population increases and demographic change are key known drivers of our future conditions. We have a good sense of what the population is going to look like in terms of numbers and demographics by 2050, and that has significant implications for food and nutrition security in all of our countries. So all of the countries will need to prioritise diversification and reduce an over-reliance on maize to mitigate the effects of climate and the effects of demographics, and that will require technology, markets and policy implementation. And investment and policy needs to focus on yield gains and productivity without agricultural land expansion. A lot of our scenarios are seeing land expansion, but that doesn't necessarily mean that agriculture will be sustainable and climate resilient into the future. So as Helen mentions about these kind of trade-offs with Miombo woodlands, for example. So our next steps, we're still drafting and redrafting and taking input and having conversations about the summaries that we've just talked about. But the next steps for us are also to think about cross-cutting policy topics. So we had a workshop a few months ago to talk about priority policy areas in each of our 4 countries. And this is just a little summary matrix of where some of those kind of policy priorities might be in terms of diversification, productivity, climate risks, and so on. And so we've kind of tried to take all of these priority areas across these different countries and think about what the kind of priority policy topics might be regionally, so across the whole of the Southern African region. And so our next steps are to think about how we pull together all of the evidence from our calibrated statements, implication statements, all of the expert knowledge that we're pulling together through iFEED to say something about agricultural resilience under climate risks, agricultural commercialization under climate risk, nutrition and food security under climate risk, and land use change and reform under climate risks. So these seem to be the really kind of emerging cross-cutting policy topics that will be of relevance across the whole of the Southern Africa region. Thinking about both policy barriers, what stops these things from happening, but also the enablers that already exist within policy that could be leveraged to make better things happen, to think about pathways from where we are now into the futures that we might want. So that brings us to the end of that whistle-stop tour, but obviously you will have had material circulated, and we are open and interested in comments and feedback and to start those conversations. So thank you very much.
Hello? Okay. Thank you, Claire, and the team for walking us through those country outputs and the key messages, and for outlining the priority policy topics for each of the countries. I am sure we have questions. I see that the chat box has got 2 questions there. Are there questions or no? It's Helen sharing information. Okay, so please just drop your questions in the chat box so that when we get to the question and answer time, we have a good discussion. At this point, before we move on to the bigger group discussion, I would like to invite Professor Tim Benton, who is the Research Director, Emerging Risk and Director of Environment and Society Program at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, and is also the leader of the AFRICAP program, for his remarks. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Tembe. Sorry I missed the start. I was actually at a Nutrition for Growth official side event talking about the role of undernutrition and malnutrition in economic growth and the need to fully integrate agriculture, food security, nutritional health, and economic growth together, because it's really important in a world where climate risks are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think we are at a place in time. We've just finished COP26, where progress has been made on the international approach to tackling climate change. But one of the big messages, I think, for me, that came out of being at COP26 was that the risks from climate change are going to increase. The risks, as has been said in the presentations, particularly from heat and drought, and some floods and changes in rainfall patterns, and the way that these will also impact on trade flows and all the rest of that. So I haven't got very much to add other than the kind of overarching view that we've got a chance now, looking ahead, to really tackle some of the existential economy-wide issues associated with how climate interacts with our food systems and our economic growth. And one of the issues that I think is becoming very, very clear is that we've got to get out of silos and stop thinking just about agriculture or health or trade or climate or environment or water, and start putting them all together. And I think if there's one kind of big message that comes out from iFEED, it's that often it's the interaction of all of these things with policy that determines whether or not the future is going to be riskier by far or just riskier by a little bit relative to where we are now. So I think given the presentations from the country teams, it's very clear that it's not just about tackling climate change, it's tackling all of these things together, and the degree to which we get out of our silos and develop coherent policy that can be applied well, we will be in a situation where we can mitigate some of those risks or not. And certainly given the uncertainty of future decades, both from a trade and geopolitical perspective and from a climate change perspective, looking ahead and planning now for decades to come rather than waiting for things to happen and responding to them, I think is absolutely key, particularly in a post-COVID world where so many things are, in a sense, up for grabs, where policy directions are not clear. We don't quite know where we're going. Once we get to the point that we are really rebuilding economies, let's rebuild them in a way that tackles all of these things together rather than piece by piece. And I think that's probably all I can say cogently at this point. Thank you, Tembi, back to you.
Thank you, Tim, for those interventions. I think if there's anything as well that has shown us the need to work quite closely together across sectors is COVID as well, right? We all thought it was a health crisis until there was food shortages when countries closed their borders and we couldn't move food from South Africa to Zimbabwe to Zambia. So I think that's one message that really, as we go into the discussions, we need to take quite seriously. At this point, we are going to move on to the Ifit Champions. Yeah. In each of the countries, we have champions. In some we have one, in some we have two. And would like to hear from the champions or get feedback rather from their sort of early engagement interventions of how they've been interacting with different stakeholders at country level in trying to share what is coming out of iFEED. Let me maybe today start with yesterday we had a discussion and we started with the champions that were in the room. Ian, maybe if you can just check for me online which champions we have online so that we can go to them. I think we have Zambia online. Let's see if we can get some reflections from Zambia. Okay, all right. We don't seem to have the Ifit champion from Zambia. We can begin with some reflections from the champions here in the room. I think yesterday we started with Dr. Jamali because he sits here, but maybe we can reverse roles and start from that end of the room. Ian, if you can help me with the mic. So we have had quite a bit, I mean, from the reflections that Chilizi shared in the beginning, where he spoke about the message. He asked us to listen quite closely to what the message coming out of the countries are. And I mean, I heard quite a bit. I heard about resilience in Tanzania and about sort of moving in the sort of technology side of things. I heard about land expansion in some countries. There were quite a number of messages that came out from the presentations we had from Claire and the team. So Prof. Sue, you have the mic if you can go first. Thank you.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I think from South Africa's point of view, really, it's showing that whichever scenario it is, there need to be different policy considerations. So although we have cross-cutting policy for climate change, and it is stretching across all of the departments and ministries, we really need to be able to have a good conversation, because as we've seen, of course, there are some variations in the rainfall, then that comes through with the increased variability of rain to the increased variability in crop production. And we've seen some of those extremes in the last 5 years because of drought, and then it comes through to the nutritional security. But many of those things are also dependent on the water. And so the water and the environment ministries also need to be involved. So really looking at, there's no way to get out of it without looking at the cross-cutting effects for policy. And so I think that that part has to be emphasized.
Intervention. I actually wonder, this is not a question for Prof. Sue, but it's something for maybe colleagues here to just think about. When we are talking about working together across sectors, there's obviously the issue of interest from different sectors, right? Like if you're talking water, you have mining also interested in the water, you have agriculture also interested in the water, even wildlife and, you know, all those people are also interested in the water. So the question is, who facilitates that working together? Yeah. Is it something that is coordinated centrally from, say, a Ministry of Development Planning in countries where that exists? In countries where that doesn't exist, where does that get coordinated? Because I think that is where we need to be taking the iFEED messages. We don't necessarily need to take the iFEED messages to agriculture, because on their own, they'll be thinking about their interests. But is there a central point that coordinates all of this that we need to use as an entry point? So I just want the colleagues here to think about it. In Tanzania, where does that happen? In Malawi, where does that happen? In South Africa, where does that happen? All right, who is next on our list? Yes, please. Maybe let me call on my DQ from Malawi.
All right, thank you very much. So for Malawi, I would say we haven't done that much in terms of the stakeholder engagement, despite the involvement in some of these meetings and so forth. But what we're looking for right now is what we have to do now going forward. We were in discussion yesterday between myself, Jamal and Pamela, in terms of what are the key next steps that we have to do to make sure that all these policy issues are taken on board. So basically what we're looking at is actually to engage all the different stakeholders, especially like selling the idea of these policy scenarios. So once we have done that, and we have to make sure that all the key stakeholders, all the influencers, they're aware of what it entails in detail, not just in passing, but they fully understand the policy issues in detail. Then after we have done that, we have to organize some sort of another conference or some sort of another meeting where there should be key discussions to gain feedback, to get key lessons learned from the various stakeholders. Why we're doing this? Because we have noted that some of these policy influencers or policy implementers, once they have got these policy ideas, they actually listen to them and you feel like, okay, they're going to adopt it. But at the end of the day, they will just shut it down because they have got other key priorities. So we have to make sure that they understand and we are trading at the same level. And once we do that, we should be able to identify those common grounds where they fit into their main priorities. For example, right now, Malawi is in its early stages of implementing the 2063 vision. And I believe that this is actually the right time where we can fit into some of these policy issues which have emanated from the iFEED research into that vision, and would actually play a very large role into that aspect. So by bringing together all the key stakeholders, all the influencers, making sure that they understand the whole process, we believe that it's going to work out. And the next big thing that we would also plan to do is that we have to advocate for it. We have to make a lot of noise about it, because sometimes if people don't accept your ideas, but when you make a lot of noise, they tend to naturally accept and understand and ask a lot of questions. And in that process, acceptance actually becomes, actually increases. So we're now looking at making sure that we don't just like create awareness of these policy issues, but making sure that they are actually implemented at the end of the day, because what's going to happen is they are going to happen in Malawi at the end of the day, looking at all those different scenarios on high climate risk, especially when you look at the road to hell. It actually shows that if we don't do this, actually we are collapsing. Yeah. And that is one of the key messages that we have to communicate out there, that if we don't consider some of these policies, this is the vision that we are seeing ourselves in the next 20 years, in the next 50 years. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, DQ. Maybe let's stay with Malawi because you have mentioned that you have just started implementing Vision 2063, yeah? 2063 sounds so far. I'm not even sure when we're going to get there, yeah? But Tim mentioned that we are just coming out of COP, yeah? And with COP came commitments, as is usually the case with these sort of big international meetings. Is there an opportunity for Malawi to look at what was promised at COP? Because there's an opportunity to revise the NDCs, right? All the countries have an opportunity to revise the NDCs, but at the same time, you're just starting a new strategy. So staying within Malawi, let me come maybe to Dr. Jamali to say, between NDCs, Vision 2063, are there any other opportunities? And then remember, we've just come out of COP. Things are hot, but we are going into Christmas and everybody shuts down and closes and then comes back next year and we start on new things as if the other things never happened, right? So how do we make sure that we strike whilst the iron is still hot, whilst everybody still has these things on their minds? Dr. Jamali, maybe I can get your reflections.
Thank you so much, Tembi, and good morning, everyone online. Maybe starting with the question that you just presented here, how do we sustain the impetus that's been generated from COP 2060, 2020, is it COP 2026, something like that, yeah? Yeah. So like my colleague DQ mentioned, Malawi is at a very opportune time in terms of mainstreaming policies towards addressing the climate, food security, and nutrition integration. Why? We have a new vision. It's Malawi 2063. Do not confuse it with the African Union. It's Malawi 2063. Now, true to what you said, 2063, it sounds far-fetched, quite a remote vision. But in terms of its operationalizing, it's blocked into 10-year plans. So we have the first 10-year implementation plan that has been launched just a fortnight ago. And what this does is it outlines the catalytic, transformative, and game-changer interventions across the pillars and enablers of that particular vision. So we've got issues to do with the pillar of agriculture productivity and commercialization, which iFEED plays a critical role to provide evidence for sustainable policies that should transform the agriculture sector and commercialize it to generate the much needed wealth for the nation. Two key milestones are being pursued in this first 10-year block. One, graduating Malawi into a middle income economy. Secondly, ensuring that we meet most of the sustainable development goals. Now, how does this work builds on the impetus that's been generated from COP26? You see, we cannot deny the fact, and Professor Benton just mentioned that we can't deny the fact that we need an integrated, multi-pronged approach to addressing climate and food systems challenges. Now, our entry point in this regard, having a new vision, is that there will be new policies that have to be developed to operationalize that particular vision. That's our entry point, because we need to provide evidence for those policies, evidence of the future projections of our food systems, our agriculture productivity, our commercialization, drive, and so on and so forth. Now, looking at iFEED, the fact that it's producing inputs that are providing updates on emissions, but also giving us a picture on how those emissions will transform the agriculture sector, productivity, market issues, trade, and so on and so forth. This is very key to the first pillar of the vision. So our entry point as Malawi is that I, coming from the National Planning Commission, would have to make sure that this too is integrated within the policy formulation processes. How do we do that? We're already engaging with various actors on the ground. The Ministry of Agriculture is a key ministry, but like you have mentioned, and just to answer your query, that we need a central coordinating agency, and that's the one that has got the mandate to craft the medium and long-term development, policy for the country. That's the National Planning Commission. But it will not go it alone. It has to work with CISANET, because we need all the civil society actors on the agriculture platform. We also need the private sector to come in, because the market part is actually in the hands of the private sector. Government needs to provide some policy frameworks that facilitate those kind of processes. So like my friend DQ mentioned, first thing is engagement. Engagement gear number one is to make iFEED known to all actors on the ground. What is iFEED? What can it do? How is it going to be relevant in our policy processes beginning now? What kind of policy frameworks do we have to put in place? That's gear number one. Gear number two is now to build on the iFEED processes outputs into the policy planning initiatives. So for example, we are talking about the 4 scenarios. The key question that should come is, what kind of policies do we need to formulate that will integrate issues of climate, food security, and nutrition, addressing all these possible scenarios that we're talking about? That requires a very thorough academic thinking. The last one is that gear number 3 has to focus on ensuring policy implementation. You see, Malawi is never short. All these propositions that are coming from the scenarios, they're already in the policies, but they have not seen the light of being implemented. The key question is, how do we make sure that we are fast-tracking implementation of these policies towards the medium-term goal of a middle-income economy for the country? Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Jamadi. Very impassioned response there. And I think it's good we have you, who is part of the National Planning Commission, because you sit in a central role that can appreciate, the sort of input that iFEED can have into the planning process. I think I saw a message here from Tim, says COP27 will take an African focus like no other, and with new push on NDC, some of these issues will be very lively political. We have a comment from Amanda Pabanga, who says, I fully agree with the Malawian feedback. Engagement of the key stakeholders will be very important for the success of our implementation. This should be the case in all 4 African pilot countries. Thank you so much for those comments. Should I leave Malawi? Pamela, are you covered? Do you want to come in? You have to come in. From a civil society point of view, working with government to make sure that the policies are implemented. Let's hear your reflections. Thank you, Pamela.
Okay, thank you so much, Tembi. I think Andrew covered it all, because we had a heated discussion or debate yesterday, and he insisted that, Pamela, but are you sure you're engaging the right gear? Who are you engaging to catalyze your propositions? You need to make sure that you're closely connected to the National Planning Commission. So we are so appreciative and thankful to the NPC they are so busy, by the way, but they accepted to be part of the process. And we think that is the right direction towards ensuring that we are getting traction out of the iFEED process. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela, for that. And we encourage you to work with the NPC as called for that. Let's move on to, do you want to come in, DQ? Okay, let's have DQ before we move on to Tanzania.
From Andrew's comments, I just wanted to emphasize on one thing that he has actually highlighted, which is also very much important on implementation. Norma yesterday highlighted one of the key issues where she said most of the African countries, we are very much good in developing rosy policies. But when it comes to implementation, we are like very far behind. So I just have to emphasize, not only for Malawi, but also for the other 4 iFEED countries, that implementation should be our topmost priority, because at the end of the day, it doesn't actually make sense. We have good policies, good plans, good scenarios, good outputs, then they just sit under the table. We have to make sure that we work on them, we implement them, and then at the end of the day, they have to make a very good impact. They have to make a big difference out there. Yeah, so thanks, Andrew, for raising that. Yeah.
Thank you, DQ, for coming in there. Let's move on to our colleagues just next door to DQ there, Tanzania, to hear their reflections. You've heard what the future looks like for Tanzania. What can we do now to make sure that we raise the alarm?
Thank you very much. I think the research and the whole process has highlighted what the future or futures will look like. And it's the right time that we should blow the trumpet, because I think some years ago, somebody made a prediction of for a pandemic, and maybe nothing was done. And here we are in the midst of a pandemic, unprepared or not knowing what we have to do. So this is the same case that we are looking into the futures and 2050s. Not necessarily that we find ourselves in the 2050s, but the generations that are going to be there in the 2050s that need to enjoy life the same way we found life, maybe better than we have found it. So what we have to do for one part is having these evidences, but also, like we have emphasized before, that we have to prepare the right policies that will guide us and then implement those policies. So we are not different like the other countries. We have these policies. We make them and maybe sometimes update them, but implementation becomes a problem. So it's high time now, like Tim emphasized, that people should come out of their silos, work together, engage. So we look into several aspects from the agriculture, the water sector. As we see for Tanzania, the central part, like we said, I think we look into the land expansion, we look into population increase, we look into the nutrition side. It's very bleak, and then it's important that we work together so that these things find a commonality that we can all have a future that we want. But the other issue, like you said before, it's around the water. It's because we insist on the technologies. In one aspect for us is how are you going to ensure food security, but in the midst of a drought situation? So we need to have proper technologies, infrastructure that will ensure farmers that are able to cope those situations. And then if it's a water storage, you know, like for this year, we have experience already. There's like water scarcity, but we don't know droughts are going to be there. But how are we prepared to face that? Because at some point we have a lot of water that just goes into the ocean. So we don't capture the water. We don't have storage facilities enough to cater for all those other activities from different competing sectors. And like you said, which one now is coordinating? So likely one of the platforms that for engagement is going to be crucial. We have in the Ministry of Water, we have the Matter Stakeholders Forum, where from the national to the basin level, so we have like 9 hydrological basins. So in those basins, from grassroots level, we have water user associations, we have catchment committees, we have the basin boards, to the national level where we have the National Matter Stakeholder Forum. So these actually involve a lot of other stakeholders from the communities. And they from the agriculture, mining, manufacturing, livestock keepers, and everybody else within the platforms. And then they can actually plan, engage, and then in implementing our National Development Vision 2025, which is just a few years ahead, but planning also into the future, it's important that these are engaged. And for that, those platforms, I think many stakeholders can be reached. And they have that, I think it's every year they meet twice. So it's important that these outputs are also communicated in those kind of meetings. Thank you. Maybe my colleagues would add further.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Mbungu, for those interventions, and also actually for identifying these multi-stakeholder coordination platforms as an opportunity for the iFEED outputs to influence the decisions that are made at that level, mostly because those platforms bring everyone together. So, you know, when you were talking, it was interesting to me because when I know technology fix is one of the sort of proposed paths for Tanzania, right? And for me, when I think technology, it's probably a very limited idea of what technology is. But when you started talking about water and how, you know, you lose a lot of water into the oceans, and then now we're thinking about water harvesting, you know, like technology in different spheres or different sectors, that could be the sort of path for development for Tanzania. So many opportunities there. Thank you so much for highlighting that. I'll then hand over to Vivian. Oh, okay, just hand over the mic then. All right, thank you.
Okay. 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 Thanks very much for the discussion. And we have. Hello. We have heard much from my colleague from Tanzania. And the only issue I can add, as Tanzania, as a government, you have already started to implement some issues, especially in CSA issues activity, in creating awareness and other things, so that people, they can react on those issues, so that to combat the problem of food security and other things. Doctor have already addressed many things in Tanzania, but we should know how to explore, to put more effort so that to attain those goals iFEED have targeted to reach. As Tanzania, we advise or we give comments to increase those efforts to those politicians so that they can address everything that are needed in CSA activities and other things. That's the only things I can add there. Thanks.
Thank you, Gerald, for that intervention. And it's good because you come from government, right? So when we are talking about what government needs to do, we are actually talking about what you need to do because you're part of the system. So, on the chat, my colleague Simba is just bursting everybody's bubble here because we've all been talking about how we have wonderful policies and everything. But Simba says, no, we don't have wonderful promises. We have wonderful wish lists of what we want to do. But these are not policies because Africa has a long list of wishes with no specifics on implementation modalities and funding modalities. This is why there is no implementation. There is no commitment on resources or specific actions. We need to do more than including iFEED results into policies. We need to see how governments can be specific on actions and funding commitments. So this is taking things a step further. It's not just saying iFEED has got all these sort of, we are looking into the future and iFEED says this is what's going to happen in the future and you need to do this. But we're saying that once we have done that, from the government side, people like Gerald that are in the system, can you show that you really want to address the situation by making funding commitments? Because we know that if there's no budget allocated to any action, nothing really happens, yeah? It just gets relegated to a long list of wishes that we all have. But we need to make sure that we see funding commitments. We see work plans with timelines, with targets, with numbers of how we want to see things changing. So that's the challenge there that's coming through in the chat group from my colleague Simba. I think I give it to you, Vivian, now. Okay, thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Vivian Kazi, FANPA node from Tanzania. I just wanted to add from what my colleagues have said, and I support specifically on the issue of implementation. And we have had some people experience from different countries coming to like Tanzania to learn on how to develop those policies, strategies, and plans. So that means we have very good policies in terms of putting together things that we want to do, but the problem again is on the implementation. So for the iFEED presentation that Marceline has presented, I think it's very relevant specifically for our country as we are implementing now the 5-year development plan phase 3. We started this year for the next 4 years until 2025. So it is important to take note on the evidence-based findings. And the good thing is that the current government regime, they support research and development. And they've from different speeches, you've heard them saying that we need research so that we can make research-based decisions. So it is important also to take note of that and to really engage with policymakers to inform them on the findings from the iFEED. And from the agriculture sector, just as in some other regions in Africa, Tanzania, more than 50% of our population, which is approximately 60 million, are engaged in the agriculture under the smallholder farming. And it is still informal. Most of them are cultivating less than 2 acres. So anything that relates to supporting them from where they are, because that is their main economic activity, is I know it will have some government attention, it will have some political attention. So it's important to engage with policymakers to make sure that they take aboard all the key messages from the iFEED. Thank you.
for that intervention. And I am very sure you'll work quite closly with the colleagues from Tanzania. We will give the mic here in the room to Noma, who will be our last speaker in the room before we sort of wrap everything up. Noma, over to you.
Good day, colleagues. Thanks, Chair. Just to add on what Prof. Sue has said in the case of South Africa, because as the NAMC, we sit as a strategic body that advises the minister and all the directly affected groups. So one of the things that we will do to ensure that this information is disseminated to all stakeholders, one, we will do a policy brief as the organization that we will release. And secondly, we plan on having a workshop with all the relevant stakeholders that will include the civil society, private sector, which includes all the agricultural industries, government officials, policymakers, farmers, and all the farmer organizations. So that's what we plan on doing. And also, thirdly, we are planning on publishing this information on all the publications we have as the NAMC. We have quite a number of publications as the organization, and also on some of the magazines that we have as the agricultural magazines that we have in the country. And one thing that we need not to underestimate is social media. So as NAMC, we are quite active on the social media. So we will ensure that this information gets to the social media as well. We will most also definitely shoot a video which will focus on the results that we have as South Africa. And that video will be published on all our social media platforms. Thanks.
Outlining the process that as South Africa you're going to take to make sure that iFEED does not stay locked up in office cabinets, but that it becomes a thing that is alive, that everybody has access to and everybody knows about it. So there's a comment here from Andy. I guess it's a bit of a caution to all of us here in the room. He says that his idea for iFEED is that we show what the value of highly effective policy is. We are not making predictions per se, but we are showing the value of effective policy implementation. So I think as we think about the challenge of implementation that we have also highlighted, we see iFEED as a sort of one of those tools that can be available to ensure that our governments can effectively implement the good policies that we come up with, or the ones that are existing, but still reminding you of that message from Simba that says we need to see commitment. With commitment, then we'll see implementation. So thank you very much to the team that is here in the room with me. I know that we have Zambia represented by Nawiko, who is online. Nawiko, I will give you an opportunity to come in if you want to just share some reflections or not. I know that you were not part of the meeting from the start, so I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you do want to share something, please feel free to come in and intervene.
Thank you very much, Tembi, for that, and thanks for all the speakers. Just like the other countries, I think the issue of implementation is quite key in our countries. Implementation of policies and plans. In Zambia, we have been tackling about this issue of implementation. And just now, we normally do our budget analysis. And when you look at the budget analysis, the results which are coming from there, you'll find that more than 70% of the budget allocated to the agricultural sector does not address issues of the key drivers of agricultural change. So we have put up a plan of how to engage our new ministers, our new permanent secretaries, and one key ministry which will be engaging is the new Ministry of Green Economy and the Environment. And we have already started meeting some of them, and we will continue meeting these ministries just to emphasize the need to fund the key drivers of agricultural change. Thank you, Tembi.
Awiko, for that intervention and for sharing some of the sort of plans that Zambia has to make sure that we push this work forward. So I think that sort of brings us to the end of the discussions for this morning, afternoon. And I think maybe let me just read a message to Tim Malawi, because I think I had skipped that message, but it's coming from Andy, and he says, "Thank you, Tim Malawi. Let's ensure we hold an iFEED discussion meeting with the NPC and other key government stakeholders, e.g. the EAD for NDC drafting and National Resilience Strategy implementation around the season and annual meeting early in 2022. So I think that's some excitement and really already seeing connections of opportunities that we can sort of explore. Thanks, Andy, for that comment. Thank you to our champions for listening quite attentively and for reflecting and already identifying areas of convergence in places where they've been, and also identifying entry points for making sure that iFEED outputs and messages reach the right people, and for inviting other key stakeholders that have joined us today to be part of this meeting. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Claire and the de-risking and policy engagement team for putting together the messages, for pulling, iFEED can tend to be so technical, but when presented the way it was presented today, I think it simplified things quite well. So thank you very much for that hard work. I also like to thank Ian next to me here, because I feel like he was the brains behind getting all of us here together and making sure that we have the right people in the room for this discussion. So thank you, Ian, for the hard work that you have done in making sure that we get to this point. Thanks to Andy and Stuart for all the modeling work, for, I think iFEED is their brainchild. So yeah, thank you for just working with everybody to make sure that we get to this point. As we close, I would like to hand over to Dr. Mabelo, the convener of this meeting. I know I was just asked last minute to be the facilitator because she couldn't come to Pretoria, but this is still very much her meeting, and I would like to give her the last word for this meeting. Dr. Mabelo, over to you.
Thank you, Tembi. What an exciting 2 hours. There wasn't a dull moment, just as is expected for something that is new. And I keep saying that, this approach is quite new in the food system, and it's exciting, and I'm sure it's going to continue to be exciting. So thanks to all of you who participated today, particularly those of you who have been part of what they call the hard work. The Tim Bentons, the Claire Queens, the Nawikos, I could pick up a few names. Thank you very much for that hard technical work that you have put into this. To all of you participants who have listened very carefully, and those of you who gave objective comments and also shared what is happening on the ground, I really want to thank you. I think Tembi has done all the thank yous. Mine is just a message to say this, that climate change is real, and we cannot spend the rest of our time doing rhetoric, being very flowery in our language and all that. This is real, and it affects all of us. And for Africa particularly, you know, we are really beginning to feel it. I mean, I've never seen such high temperatures in Africa ever. So it affects all of us. So we need to be, you see, we are generating all this evidence, right? Which is good. On paper, you know, we are generating it, but we need to make sure that our policymakers are taking it up and using it effectively in their frameworks, responding to their blueprints. You know, they have this vision 2030, 2050s, they have national development plans and so on. So this sort of work that you are doing, which is really good work, needs to be speaking to those national frameworks, to the regional frameworks. And this is why I keep saying we need to scale out to the level of the African Union Commission. And look, I am willing to help as much as I can to promote iFEED to those levels. So let's make sure that, you know, this goes across the continent, because I'm sure there are institutions out there that are ready and willing to take on this work, training people in member states. So please feel free to reach out if there is any help that I can provide. Otherwise, I must admit I have really been excited about working with iFEED over the last few months. So wishing everybody all the best. To those of you who are traveling in Africa, please mask up, stay safe, and let's keep doing this good work for the continent. So thank you so much. Tembi, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Mavelo, for those words. And I think I've just seen a note from Andy and Stuart there to say that there are a lot of modelers behind iFEED. I know I mentioned that it was their brainchild, but we appreciate that there are a lot of modelers that are working with them. And we thank them as well. Might not mention them by name, but certainly we appreciate their hard work. So from me, I think I would like to bring this meeting to a close and thank everybody and invite everybody who's here in the room to join us for lunch, and everybody who's online, we say goodbye. Hope to see you another time. Thank